Let me start out by telling you that I am nonpartisan. I am the chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce and have been for 24 years. I am very fiercely pro-business. I'm proud to be an American. I'm a retired military officer, so perhaps I'm a little bit conservative on some things like the need for a strong defense. But I also have dual Luxembourgish citizenship, and I'm very proud at this point in my life to be living in Luxembourg and contributing to Luxembourg's success. So I'd like to think that I'm a little bit of a bridge, if you will. And on Thursday, we were planning on going ahead and publishing an analysis of the election. So I brought a copy of it. And that basically is what I'm going to speak to. Now, many of you who already know me, and I see quite a few people that I know, so it's nice to know that I'm in friendly company here, know that as a general rule, I don't use notes, and I speak spontaneously and off the cuff. But out of respect for you all, and out of respect for the subject, I did think it probably was a little bit of a better idea to go ahead and try and get things a little bit better organized. So I've organized this into 3 parts. The first is, what happened? The second part is, why did it happen? And the third part is, what does it mean for the Americans, for Luxembourg, and for the world? So those are the 3 things that we're going to do. Before we get into that, I have to say, je ne parle pas le français trop mal pour un vieil américain, mais ce n'est pas exactement parfait. And I certainly am not in a position to go ahead and debate in French. But I do want to say, in starting on out, that I reject the hypothesis that the Heritage Foundation's Project 25 is something that is universally endorsed by the Republican Party or by President Trump. That simply is not true, and I consider that fake news. You can believe whatever you want to believe. That's what honest citizens in free societies should believe. But I need to tell you, in starting on out, I simply do not accept that, and I have not seen any documentation, and I look at documentation, that would in any way convince me to the contrary. Now, having said that, let me get into the other stuff. This November election that we have has given a significant mandate to President Trump. And that's a very interesting game. And it really, frankly, is something that we could probably talk together for the next 3 days and not go ahead and cover everything. Here's a guy who was a successful businessman. I should tell you I'm a New Yorker. I was born and raised in New York. I'm 3/4 German and 1/4 Dutch. My Dutch settler grandparents and stuff were original settlers of New Amsterdam. What's now called Harlem in New York used to be my family's farm. So I've been around that area of the world for a long time. One thing that I should tell you about New York is that New York is big and there are multiple parts of it. Manhattan is the white-collar part of New York. It's the Brahmin part of New York. It's the elite part of New York. Brooklyn is the blue-collar part of New York. It's the part where people have blue-collar jobs and grow themselves up. Trump, if you believe he's a billionaire or not, I frankly think he still is a billionaire, but Trump is from Brooklyn. He's not from Manhattan. He thinks and acts like a blue-collar billionaire from Brooklyn. And blue-collar billionaires from Brooklyn, or blue-collar guys from Brooklyn, are, oh yeah? You push me, I push you back 5 times as hard. He is a typical blue-collar guy who happens to have done rather well. But he has a very, very Brooklyn mentality, not a white-collar Manhattan mentality. When he moved to Manhattan, he wasn't necessarily particularly well treated because he wasn't of the genre. He didn't have the right credentials. He didn't go to Harvard, he didn't go to Princeton, he didn't go to Columbia. He went to the University of Pennsylvania, which happens to be a good school, but it's not in the same league. So when you think about Trump, you need to remember that at his heart, he's a blue-collar guy who has done very, very well. And there's nothing wrong with that. But at this point in his life, the likelihood it's going to change is pretty slim. But if you understand, you know, it seems like he loves his wife, probably loved the other two as well, but he loves his present life. He loves his children. He apparently is a brilliant grandfather. He does lots of kind things and everything else like that. Does he have a past? Last time I checked, he does. But he appears to be dedicated to making America strong and to making a contribution to the country that he loves. And I think that that's sincere. Anyway, moving on from there, what happened when we started out with this election cycle, Trump was ruthlessly attacked, and there were all kinds of charges filed against him and everything else like that. Don't forget, I'm speaking to somebody who's nonpartisan, but an observer of the system who knows the system pretty well. A lot of the things, I'm not saying that Trump didn't do things that are wrong, but quite frankly, most of us do something or other wrong sometime. It's a matter of degree. And there were quite a number of things that he was accused of that if you check on around, normal people, if they were in the same situation, would never have been accused and never have been prosecuted for that. So what ended up happening is when we had the election, after Trump had defeated his Republican rivalries by being the toughest guy on the block and by being the blue-collar billionaire from Brooklyn, after he got the nomination and settled in to go ahead and run, it ended up that the more that he was attacked and the more he was prosecuted, the more campaign contributions he got. The more people who signed up to go ahead and become Republicans, because a significant, not the entire American population, there are lots of people in the United States who don't like Mr. Trump, but a significant portion of the population decided that it was unfair prosecution, and they were afraid of the possibility of the same thing happening to them. So they said, we better see if we can help this guy out because he's one of us. So he got an enormous amount of campaign contributions, and the more he was publicly attacked by the Democrats and publicly criticized by different lawsuits or other things like that, the more campaign contributions he got, the more support he got. In the election that we had in 2020, the American electorate falls into three chunks. There are the Republicans, there are the Democrats, and there are the independents. There are occasionally other little splinter party groups, but they don't really count. In the election in 2020, there were more people registered as Democrats than there were as Republicans. And 35% of the population, voting population, was registered as independents. So more Democratic registered voters and less Republican voters, and 35% of the population were Democrats. Were independents. I would argue that the Democrats voted for the Democratic candidate, Republicans voted for the Republican candidate, because that's kind of what happens, and the people who decided the election were the independents. The 35% of the voting population that was not strongly affiliated with one group or the other. Those were the people who decided what the outcome was in the 2020 election, and they gave the mandate to Mr. Biden. Mr. Biden then has had 4 years with a Democratic Senate and with partially Democratic control or reasonable amount of Democratic influence in the lower house of Congress. And what happened? The agenda that was put into most American voters are slightly right of center, kind of like Luxembourgish voters. Most Luxembourgish voters are slightly right of center. There are people on the left, there are people on the right, but the mass of the population is, in Luxembourg, slightly right of center. In the United States, it's slightly right of center. When Biden came in with the people that he came in with, it ended up, the agenda that he put forward was a bit more liberal. It wasn't a slightly right of center agenda, it was to the left. And during the time that he was in office, we ended up having a significant amount of inflation, a lot of money that were spent on arguably somewhat more left-wing agendas rather than conservative right-wing agendas. And the election that we had now was basically about, do we continue the mandate of what we have been doing for the previous 4 years, or are we not satisfied with how things are and we move things in a new direction? So, the first thing that happened was that there was a debate between Biden and Mr. Trump. And Mr. Biden, excuse the expression, but fell on his ass. He couldn't keep up with the game. He was not capable of presenting himself as a strong leader and a strong candidate. And the Democratic Party totally, the leaders of the Democratic Party totally panicked. Just literally totally panicked. And there was an enormous amount of pressure on Mr. Biden to go ahead and to step back and to pass the festive baton. Okay, that's perhaps an interesting strategy, and it might have been a sensible decision. What Mr. Biden then did is Mr. Biden recommended that Mrs. Harris, his vice president, go ahead and become the Democratic Party for candidate. He basically anointed her as his successor without the benefit of going ahead and having a primary process where people could compete. You could argue that maybe it was a little bit late in the game. You can argue that maybe there wasn't quite enough time to go ahead and do it. You can argue all kinds of things. But there are a lot of people on whom who came to the conclusion, wait a second, this is not democratic. Why are we going ahead and having one of the candidates that's sort of kind of appointed rather than being democratically elected like we normally do? So there were a lot of people who had some degree of concern about that. Okay, then we get into the game of the election. And there are lots of different ways that you can look at this, so I'll try and give you a couple of sound bites that maybe cover some of the major areas. I won't cover everything, but we are going to have a Q&A, and if you guys have questions, I'll certainly do my best to go ahead and give you my spin. But anyway, we got into the election process because of a relentless effort by both of the major political parties to arrange to have secure seats. There is a huge effort in the United States to redraw the lines of constituencies so that this place is safe and is only ever going to elect a Democrat regardless of who the heck that person happens to be. And these over here are always going to elect a Republican, and there's never a chance for anybody else. That's because of districting issues. That's probably not right. It probably would be better if we just had square blocks and everybody could compete. But the political parties, consciously for a long time, have been arranging secure seats for candidates someplace or other, and that has stuck. So now there's a significant portion of the seats in the lower house which are always going to be Democrat because of the way it's set up. It's virtually impossible for anybody else to compete in that. And by the same token, for the Republicans. So you have that stuff. That's one thing that you need to know about it a little bit. The other thing that you need to know is that the people in the middle of the country, there's a joke. When I was growing up in New York, there was a joke. And actually there was a map. And the map showed New York City, and it showed Miami, it showed Vermont for skiing, and it showed Nantucket and the islands, because that's where we like to sail. And then you get to the Hudson River, and then there's nothing from the Hudson River until you get to Denver, because we like to go skiing, so, okay, we include that as part of the country. But in between, you don't talk about anything of that whole big swath of the country. And then you get to the place where they have a little bit of skiing, and then on the other side of that is California. And there's a lot of coverage. And there really, literally, you can find this map. And it was called the Map of America. And it was an elite map that me and all of my buddies used to laugh about a little bit, and we kind of took it to heart because we lived on the right side of the street. We lived in the white-collar area. We didn't live in Brooklyn. We never went to Brooklyn. We lived in the white-collar part of the world, and we're a little bit snooty and a little bit arrogant about that, and I look back on that now and realize what an idiot I was at the time, but that's the way it was. So there's a significant part of the country that has been considered in many circles for some time as being filled with the great unwashed, and what Hillary Clinton called the deplorables. I think you all remember that quote, and other stuff like that. What Trump did during the election, being a guy from Brooklyn, who a little bit knows what it's like to be a bit discriminated against, he went all over the middle of the country where all these deplorables lived and said, you haven't been fairly treated. You are not being taken care of. These policies and procedures that are put into place by liberal elites who are coastal, either the East Coast or the West Coast, but didn't care about everything in the middle, they have taken you to the cleaners. And they fell in love with them. And they felt like here was someone who felt their pain, even though he obviously didn't need to feel their pain because of the amount of money he had, but from what he said, he was sympathetic to their cause and said, you deserve to have jobs. You deserve to be treated fairly. You deserve to have opportunities. And that's where the MAGA movement came from. The MAGA movement, Make America Great Again, came from first a guy in Brooklyn who knew what it was like being discriminated against by the elite people in Manhattan. And then all the other people, all the other blue-collar workers who saw their jobs being outsourced to other countries, and their factories and the places where they work being shut down and being in bad sets of circumstances and everything else like that. So Trump reinvented the Republican Party. The Republican Party originally was Abraham Lincoln's party, so it was originally the party that freed the slaves. But then over a considerable period of time, it gradually turned into the guys who owned the factories party. And what Trump did was he reinvented it back to being the party of the working class. The party that cares about people who are working, who have jobs, who are good citizens, who are struggling, trying to take care of their families, trying to provide for themselves, who are loyal, honest, but not being given a fair deal by the system. Mrs. Harris didn't do that. Mrs. Harris did not do a single press conference for the entire span of the election cycle. She did no open press conference where any journalist could come and ask questions. Not a single one. What she only did was she did several controlled interviews which were pre-selected. And to a significant part of the population, that came across as, this woman is not there for us. She was asked the most sweetheart question you could have been asked on The View, which is very left-wing feminist. She was asked the question, would you do anything different than Mr. Biden has done if you're given the opportunity to be the President of the United States? What would you do different? This is a time where there has been high inflation, petrol prices going through the roof, increase in regulatory compliance issues which make it hard to start new and small businesses, bigger and bigger and bigger government. And she was asked the sweetheart question so that she could differentiate from the guy who has been in power for 4 years. And she said, not that I can think of. She totally blew answering that question. And it resonated all across the voting population. She can't think of anything she would have done differently in a time period when we have had high inflation and we have had lots of problems. No, nothing I can think of, nothing at all. That probably was the trigger point where she lost the election. If I can think of one single incident that cost her the election, that would be it. She had a perfect opportunity to reinvent herself as being different from old Joe and to chart a new path. That's one thing. The second thing is, and I say this with a little bit of trepidation, she's Indian. Our family background is from India, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's wonderful, and that's part of America's tradition of welcoming people and being successful. And somehow or other during her campaign, she tried to reinvent herself as a black person. She's not a black person from Africa, she's a black person, she's a darker person from India, married to a white Jewish guy, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's the American way of doing things. But somehow or other, she tried to convince a certain part of the population that she was black like them. And they didn't buy it. They just simply didn't buy it. They considered it a con job that didn't work on it. Anyway, at the end of the day, it's important to know that in America there are some states are always going to vote Republican because of the way things are done, and some who are always going to vote Democratic. And then there are 5 states that you're not sure of. And those 5 states decide who's going to win. Those 5 states. And Trump won all 5 of them. Every single one of them, he won. Now, if you look at the details, which I do, you will find that even though there was a rather substantial number, unbelievable number of electoral votes that went to Donald Trump, the margin at which he won those electoral votes in individual places was rather narrow. A couple 100,000 votes here, 500,000 votes there, gave you that block of electoral votes. It wasn't a total sweep. But if you look at who voted how, you will find that black men increased their vote for Trump compared to 2020. White women increased their vote for Trump compared to 2020. Young men substantially increased their vote for Donald Trump, and in the previous election they hadn't even particularly contributed. Jewish voters and Muslim voters increased their vote for the Republican Party compared to the Democratic Party. So Trump got a significant portion of the spread of votes of all different kinds of groups. And the reason he did it, in addition to the things that I've already talked about, there is kind of a rule in America, and it was put out and promoted by Bill Clinton, or by Bill Clinton's team when he was running for the election. And it's called, "It's About the Economy, Stupid." And the rule is very simple. You ask people, are you happier and do you feel that you're better off now than you were 4 years ago? If the answer is yes, you vote for the incumbent, because the incumbent made you better over the past 4 years. But if you don't think that you're better off now than you were 4 years ago, you think long and hard about giving the new guy who is saying that they're going to do things differently an opportunity. So, among a number of things, Trump also benefited from that basic rule that the one who's going to win the presidency is the one who takes care of the economy. So you had that. You also have the issue of immigration and illegal immigration at America's borders. Lots of different ways of looking at that. America is a nation of immigrants, and always has been a nation of immigrants. I can't exactly say that, I think that we owe apologies, and I think we're a bit ashamed of how the resident population of what became the United States, the original resident population, was treated by the Dutch, the French, the Germans, the Luxembourgers, who came to America and took it on over. But America is a nation of immigrants, and we have multiple cultural groups, multiple religious groups, and we have an incredibly broad diversity model. So, all right, to cut that part of it short, Trump won the election. He won the popular vote, which a Republican hasn't done in a long time. And if nothing else gives him legitimacy, that certainly gives him legitimacy, because he won a majority of all of the people who voted. And in addition to that, because of the Electoral College, he got a substantial number of votes in the tally. Now, I should say, most people don't understand the Electoral College mentality. They say, well, why don't we just do it based on the popular vote? Well, the original plan, and the way they constructed it, was they said, hey, you know, we don't want the country to be dominated by the people who live in the cities and the people in the rural areas getting screwed. So the whole idea behind the Electoral College is to balance the rights and the protection of people in rural areas compared to a heck of a lot more people living in the city. It's a compromise. But that's why we have this thing called the Electoral College, is to make sure that you don't have a country that's totally dominated by the urban areas, and that there's some degree of fairness and protection for people who live in rural areas. Okay. We could spend a whole lifetime going ahead and talking about that, but I think that that's a soundbite that most of you aren't familiar with, which is probably worth saying. All right, anyway, now we have a slight Republican majority in the lower house, which means that the lower house is going to really have to work hard going ahead and keeping everybody happy who happens to be a Republican in order to do that, or they're going to have to make deals with the Democrats. And it's a pretty slim majority, so they'll probably have to do a little bit of both. The same thing in the Senate. In the Senate, there is, I think, a 3-vote Republican majority. So elect 100% of the lower house every 2 years. That's intended to give a possibility to shake up the government a bit, because you can elect 100% of the lower house every 2 years. But for the Senate, you only elect a third of the Senate every 2 years, so it's a 6-year cycle until you change the Senate. And the reason for that is because the founders wanted to moderate against radical change. They wanted change to happen, and they wanted things to evolve, but they didn't want to run the risk of a demagogue immediately taking over everything overnight. So that's why they put it together. So that's deliberately the way it's done, and quite frankly, it's a pretty sensible way of going ahead and doing things. Anyway, when Trump first became president, I honestly think he didn't think that he was going to get elected. And then it's like, oh my gosh, I'm now going to be president of the United States. Heck, what do I know about running a country? He had quite a learning curve that he went through. It was not easy. He's a tough guy. He worked hard to go ahead and be up to the challenge, but he had his hands full. Now, coming back out of being out of office for 4 years and out of already being president once, he understands how Washington works. And I am told by the people that I know, as well as reports that I read in the press, that he and his team are dead set serious of trying to go ahead and get this right based on their vision of what's good for the country. And they know that they have 2 years. If they don't get it right in 2 years, they're going to lose the lower house. And if they lose the lower house, they won't be able to get anything done for the next 2 years until we get into another presidential election, which Trump can't run in. So Trump knows that he has 2 years to make a substantive difference and to go ahead and to make America greater and to build some degree of legacy, because this is it. He's not going to have another chance to go ahead and do that. This means that he is going to have to be very smart, very focused, very hardworking, but he's also going to have to do some degree of compromising. He cannot totally have his own way. He's going to have to make deals and compromise. He's going to try and make as few deals as possible, and he's going to try and be as tough as he can and win as much as he can. But he got a good mandate, but it's not good enough so that he can do whatever the hell he wants to do. He's going to have to compromise, make deals, accommodate, find solutions. Quite frankly, I think that that's good for democracy. So, we're going to play that game. We're going to see how it works on out. That's a little bit talking about the process of the election and kind of what happened and where we're at now. Okay. Then the last little part of this, before we get into Q&A and that kind of thing, is, well, what's going to happen now? Well, if you look at the agenda for America that Trump will put into place, the first part of it is he's focused on lowering energy prices in order to stop inflation and to lower costs so that there is greater spending power for this group of people that he said, I will take care of you. He wants to drill, baby, drill. He wants to unleash the power of the United States. Apparently, from everything I've seen and what I read, has more energy, more petroleum energy than any place else on the planet. Just think about it. One of the last things that Mr. Biden has done is he's put into place a procedure saying you can't drill along the East Coast and the West Coast of America. They know that there's petroleum on the East Coast and the West Coast of America. They know that it's there. But By the time we deplete all the rest of the petroleum products on the rest of the planet, there still will be the east coast of America that hasn't been drilled and the west coast which hasn't been drilled. America has a lot of petroleum, more than any place else on the planet. Trump wants to tap into a bit of that because he wants to lower energy costs. And he says, if I lower energy costs, not only will I be taking care of this constituency, they won't have to pay as much at the pump, it won't cost as much to go ahead and to move products from A to B to sell, so he believes that that will significantly reduce the impact of this onerous degree of inflation that we have. And by the same token, if we reduce the price of petroleum and we reduce energy costs, it makes America extremely attractive to chemical industries. It makes America very, very attractive for lots of new manufacturing activities to take place because the energy costs will be so low. So that's the first thing. He wants to go ahead and reduce energy costs for multiple reasons, all of which make sense in support of an America First agenda. Second thing is he wants to bring back and encourage and support companies that are outside the United States to go ahead and to build factories in America so we can have more American jobs. And he will be pushing that very hard. He'll partially be pushing it because with lower energy costs, it will be attractive. He also has said that he's dedicated to go and further to go ahead and reduce taxation on companies and on individuals. And taxes in America are lower than taxes in Europe. We do not have a value-added tax in America like you have over here. Well, I should say we have over here. By the way, I absolutely love being here and I'm not planning on leaving. But I'm trying to give you a balanced view of what's going on. So so he would like to encourage German petrochemical companies to come to America to go ahead and set up. He wants to encourage a lot of people to come and set up factories in the United States to employ American workers so they pay taxes and have better terms and things. So that's the second part of it. He will make the American military even stronger than it is today. Right now it's the strongest military on the planet, but he will make it even stronger. Because he wants to make the American military so strong that everybody thinks it's suicidal to go ahead and challenge America militarily or Americans' interests unilaterally. But he would like to do that in partnership. Now, I think you will find, and I know people are nervous about it, that Trump is not planning on leaving NATO, and there is not a lust and a desire on the part of Congress to go ahead and leave NATO. We are committed to NATO, and think about it. Most Americans nowadays have grandparents, great-grandparents, whatever, who came from Europe. Americans view Europe as our ancestral home and view Europeans as family. Sometimes families can be a little bit dysfunctional. Sometimes you can fight a little bit within a family, but if someone attacks your family, you give them what you can back. America is dedicated to Europe, it's dedicated to NATO, but the Americans want to be respected, want to be appreciated, and want to be treated fairly. Those are basically Trump's rules, and that's basically what I think the majority of Americans want too. Want to be respected, appreciated, and treated fairly. Right now, the US pays 4/5 of the NATO budget. We've been doing that for quite some time. And there is a feeling on the part of a reasonable number of Americans that Europe is successful enough that it could pay a bit more. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're leaving or we're doing less, but it's like, wait a second, why are we, the United States, paying 4/5 of the NATO bill, which is mostly intended to protect Europe, and why don't the Europeans pay a little bit more? Don't want them to go broke, but there should be a little bit more. So there is a push to go ahead and have Europe pay a bit more. He did that in his first term, and quite frankly, it was really smart that he did that, because when we got in the situation with Ukraine, if NATO had not gotten a bit stronger, we would not have been in a position to help Ukraine to the extent that we have. And that has been admitted by a number of senior politicians in Europe. So we have that part of that.